Okay. Okay, so we decided when we were talking about the Komagata Maru and Sikhs in the diaspora, the notion of Miri Piri came about in that conversation, and so we decided that we would situate this Komagata Maru incident within this deeply held, absolutely central Sikh tenet, namely that what Daljit calls the inalienable, this inalienable combination of the spiritual and empirical life for the Sikh, that of Miri Piri. So, and most of you will know that traditionally Miri Piri is traced to Guru Har Gobind, where he donned a sword belt with two swords, one Piri, representative of his spiritual mission, and the second Miri, demonstrating the active representation of his spiritual mission and leadership, particularly within the context of the fight against injustice. Now, it was interesting, I just grabbed Daljit Singh's Essentials of Sikhism that I haven't probably looked at since I was doing my PhD research, and it's a fantastic book. I loved it in terms of his deep spiritual engagement with some of these concepts. He says that the Sikh compulsion, he used the word compulsion, which I thought was phenomenal. To stand up to injustice can in fact be traced much earlier to Guru Nanak, as highlighted by Guru Nanak's critique of Emperor Babur Vani. And I just posted it here. The kings had lost their higher consciousness, reveling in pleasure and sensuality since Babur's rules being proclaimed. Even the princes have no food to eat. The Muslims have lost their 5 times of daily prayer. The Hindus have lost their worship. Some have returned to their homes, and meeting the relatives, they ask about their safety. For some it is preordained that they shall sit and cry out in pain. Whatever pleases him comes to pass, O Nanak. What is the fate of mankind? And it goes on from there. Now, Daljit, oh good, that one's not changing. Daljit Singh says that the film has, or the hymn has 4 implications. First, that oppression and injustice are violations of God's law. Second, that, quote, as master and God of love, harmony has to be maintained by his will. Thirdly, it is the spiritual duty and responsibility of the God-man to confront injustice. And fourth, quote, resistance to oppression was a task and a target laid down by the Guru for the religious society he was organizing. And then, of course, within a wider historical perspective, this notion came to its full fruition with the creation of the Khalsa, bringing these deals to their highest expression in the ritualized creation of a society motivated by both spiritual and temporal ideals. The Sant Sipahi, defined by MacLeod as the ideal man or the ideal Sikh, one possessing humility and piousness, yet also possessing the martial qualities of the Sipahi, the soldier, quote, ever courageous and bravely prepared to fight gallantly for justice, even if it should mean death. So that's how we're situating the chartering of the Komagata Maru by Gurdit Singh in 1914. And I think this then just puts it into an interesting, a different light perhaps, a persistence and a resilience of a distinctly Sikh way of being in the world. I think you're next, Margaret.
Okay, so then this was where Doris and I, when we were thinking about what contribution we might make, this was our opportunity to try and combine our 2 kind of perspectives on this particular issue. And it was just from those conversations that we saw that connection between that deeply held core conviction of Miri Piri and the Komagata Maru, but really we were thinking about the century that came after that. And so we looked at the Komagata Maru as this kind of distinctly Sikh way of being in the world, but also we looked at Gurdit Singh's chartering of the Komagata Maru as this initial kind of jagan, this workaround of this legislation that had been introduced. And as we know from the film we watched last night from the continuous journey, we know that Gurditt Singh was an enterprising individual, and he had this desire to both kind of make money, but also to correct what he saw was an injustice. And this deep sense of conviction was really the way we thought, okay, let's think about this combination then of the two. And so we also wanted to engage with the idea of the century that has preceded this event. And we wanted to think about the way in which Sikhs in Canada have engaged with the state. And so again, when we look at that moment in terms of the Komagata Maru, here we have a quote from James MacDonald, a Member of Parliament at the time, who said, the Hindu, as we all know, is a British subject, and the imperial government, we had a fabulous conversation about this in yesterday's session. The imperial government will look upon this kind of legislation with great care. It invites serious consideration of both Ottawa and London. So again, it's a transnational moment over a century ago. And he says, I agree in keeping foreigners out of our voters list. The Hindu, though a British subject, not one of them in 100 can speak our language. And here, these are our italics. Nor are they familiar with our laws and customs. And we know that that moment of the Komagata Maru was a moment when when Gurditt Singh and his allies on shore did become very aware of the laws and customs, and indeed we have seen, we would argue, a century of engagement with exactly those instruments. And so the Sikh response to that moment of the Komagata Maru was to negotiate with the state using the systems that are at hand, the legal challenge. And it's the knowledge of the system, so that even though highly contained, constrained, and that Bird was the only one who could represent them, and they were denied the right for appropriate legal consultation by immigration authorities, they worked towards using that system. So the onshore committee raised the funds, they mobilized the resources, they worked through the appropriate channels. And here, as Mishra, a wonderful quote that Doris found, Mishra here says, the most important aspect of that separates diasporic and Indian Sikh relationship with the state here is that in the host land, Sikhs have behaved pragmatically and used methods prescribed within a democratic setup, such as legal procedures, lobbying, and at best demonstration, end quote. While Sikhs in India have instead taken recourse to militancy, fighting for their rights and in order to protect their identity. So this is an interesting argument that in diaspora, Sikhs have become adept at utilising the mechanisms of the democratic liberal state to advance what they see as their just demands and rights in order to become effective members of community. So what we want to do is to offer you a few moments of engagement. And yesterday's presentation came up a few times in very wonderful ways. And I think Hugh presented it, this notion of the people on a road who kind of collide and meet. And we want to highlight some of these moments where there's been this kind of collision that's occurred in terms of the Canadian state, the demand for Sikh inclusion, Sikh rights, and also how India comes through in these moments of engagement in different ways. And so we want to look at, and we've selected a few, and I'm sure you could all add many others for our edification, but we've chosen a very important legal case, Singh versus the Minister of Employment and Immigration from 1985. We're going to talk about the turban incident, it's something I've written about. We're going to talk about the Sikhs and the RCMP. Doris is going to talk about Quebec's Bill 94 and the Sikh Canadians and politics. So these are just a few moments of this ongoing engagement since Komagata Maru, okay?
Now, we're going to have to fly through this, obviously.
Okay. So the Singh decision, some of you may or may not be aware of the Singh decision, and unlike, this varies just slightly from our abstract, because our abstract said we were going to look at moments of fighting over kind of religious symbols. This is not so much about religious symbols. For those of you who are familiar with Canadian jurisprudence, you might argue that, well, in the Singh case, it could be the appellants could have been anybody. But I think it does matter that in 1985, this landmark case was included 7 appellants, 6 of whom were Sikhs from Punjab. So the Singh decision, for those of you that don't know, in the 1970s in Canada, there was a growth in the number of undocumented migrants coming to Canada. And many of them were turning to the refugee process in order to regularize their ability to stay in Canada. Now, the law at that time, under I think the 1979 Immigration Act, actually did not provide the individual who was making a claim the right to make that claim in person. So you would have people making a refugee claim, but they did not have the right to make that claim in person. And this issue was brought forward by a number of lawyers. They brought it to the Supreme Court because they argued that it was a fundamental justice that when cases of life and death were at stake, one should have the right to make a presentation in person. You should have that at least one opportunity to do that. And under the current immigration regulations at the time, that was not allowed. So the Supreme Court ruling, which is Singh versus the Minister of Employment and Immigration, determined that henceforth every applicant for refugee status was going to get at least one oral hearing compatible with the importance of the refugee issue. And when looking at this legal provision, so what, I mean, and we could talk for, you know, there's much written on this case, but the important thing about this is that the 6 justices came to that decision using 2 different pieces of legislation. 3 of them used the newly formed charter, 3 of them used the old Bill of Rights. Regardless of what they determined their decision based on, they came to the agreement that everybody in Canada had a right to have the charter applied to them, whether they were a citizen or a non-citizen. And that is the landmark dimension of this ruling. So, Singh is said to be the strongest of a series of cases demonstrating that once the breach of the charter is proved, it's not easy to persuade the courts that it's justified. So Justice Wilson, she made the presentation on the 3 who used the charter to make their case. She says, it seems to me unthinkable that the charter would not apply to entitle them to fundamental justice in the adjudication of their status. In light of this landmark decision, there was a backlog of about 60,000 refugee cases with the Immigration Department. So in light of this, Ottawa held an administrative review, and for all cases prior to March 1986 that applied to certain security and medical regulations, those were given amnesty. So to our mind, this is a fundamental moment where we have this intersection between Canada and India, and where you have Sikhs in Canada, you know, using that opportunity to speak to the state through the legal process. We have the, 1984 happens, this is 1985, the ruling happens, this is 1986, you have the administrative review. I don't have the data, but I'm fairly sure a significant number of those 60,000 applicants would have been Sikhs from Punjab who were seeking security of the person in Canada. We think it's an important moment, and so we utilise it as one of these moments to identify this ongoing continuous engagement between Sikhs and the state. And the other one, something that I've written on, which is again the Legion moment. Many of you are familiar with this event. And so this was the case in the early 90s involving the Sikh veterans who were denied the right to enter the Legion. It's been written about, you know about that moment, and you know about the response that happened and how the Legion really had to kind of reorganise itself to make up for the insults that occurred. And we know that a couple of years later, Mike Harcourt, the Premier of British Columbia, invited some of those Sikh veterans to appear before the Queen at the Commonwealth Games. And so I've written about this moment in an interesting way in which Sikh veterans utilised their colonial belonging to position themselves at the centre of multicultural Canada, which is a different kind of engagement with the post-colonial. And also speaks to the kind of strategic positioning of Sikh identity across a spectrum. So here it was really re-engaging with that identity as a core member of the colonial nexus, which is an interesting moment of engagement. The Sikhs and the RCMP turban is another important moment of engagement. So this, the highly insulting calendar that was created by Herbert Bittner in response to Herman Bittner, in response to the decision to include the turban as part of the official dress in the RCMP. And so it was very much inspired by Paul Dillon's decision to join the RCMP, and the Canadian government, when they reviewed this decision, the RCMP commissioner said we should revise the official dress to incorporate the turban, and then in 1990, the Solicitor General, Pierre Cadieux, stood up in the House and announced the government's decision that the turban would henceforth be part of the official dress, and he said it was the right legal and moral thing to do. And so the RCMP moment can be interpreted in all kinds of different ways, but it certainly is a realignment of the symbolic order of the nation, and it's an indicative pushback at that time from a certain constituency within the Canadian government. You may or may not know that Baltej Singh Dhillon was just this year given an honorary degree by Kwantlen University Polytechnic for the work that he has done. And this, I just want to identify the importance of these moments for representing the symbolic incorporation of this identity of the kind of the militia Sikh, if you like, but it's identified as part of this celebration of Sikh identity in Canada, and it's part of this reinforcement of the notion of the discipline, the embodied representation of the Sikh through these bodily representations, and there's of course the earlier presentation speaks very nicely about some of how one does promote one's spirituality and sense of self, and certainly the embodied projection is an important dimension of that.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to just briefly mention the Quebec Bill 94, where a group of lawyers basically attempted to go into the legislature, and they were not allowed because they're wearing kirpans. And for me, what was interesting was the media coverage. And it was, I think, particularly interesting because there was an anti-Quebec sentiment that was going on because of this niqab bill, but also which I think played to the Sikh advantage to a certain extent. So I think there's an interesting juxtaposition there in terms of and all of these major papers covering the stories, the visibility of it, and utilizing that coverage. From the World Sikh News Council, forcing people to abandon certain religious or cultural practice is not the Canadian way, and it's not productive. So this it's not about the Sikh way, it's about the Canadian way. So aligning themselves with Sikh values and showing that what was happening in Quebec was not the Canadian way. I'm just going to have to go on. Basically, the Sikh ceremonial dagger. She said 4 minutes.
We've got half an hour for the presentation and discussion.
So okay. Okay. The dagger now allowed in the Toronto courthouses. We have Jagmeet Singh, the MPP for Bromley Gore Malton, also putting in his 2 cents worth. He's put forward amendments to a bill that solidifies religious protection of religious accommodation. This right after the year where Sikhs are not allowed into the Quebec legislature. I think that was, for me, I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition. And then I think we cannot talk about Miri Piri without looking at Sikh politicians in Canada. If we look at these numbers, they are very, very, very high. If you're interested, the agenda with Steve Aiken did a whole interview. I was also interviewed on that. The Sikhs, a political success story. With it is a, let's see if we can do that at the end. If you're interested in, there's a, Navdeep Bains does a wonderful interview with Aiken, basically saying that Sikhs are involved in politics because why? Because of Miri Piri. So totally makes that connection, which I had also made in my interview, because they were asking, why are there so many Sikhs in politics? So I think this also, in terms of utilizing the system, understanding how to get certain things going, whether it's provincially or within the federal scene. I'm just going to leave it at that, but I think it sort of makes sense in terms of what we're trying to say. So what does this mean for Canada? In terms of what we've just been talking about, Sikhs are breaking the trend of minorities in terms of underrepresentation in Canadian politics. Far more represented than in terms of their actual numbers in Canada. They are fostering those factors that seem to contribute to a Sikh and minority traditions' political involvement, the value on serving others, a cultural history that emphasizes political participation, and this is what's actually being said in this interview. How do we get more minorities into politics? You look at the cultural history that emphasizes this political participation. You find institutions that embrace the democratic process that can also be done as a venue for mobilizing. And then a reflection of those values within the public discourse. And I think this is where that last part of our abstract, where we say, what does Canada have to learn? And I think this is a wonderful moment of Canada saying, teach us. Teach us about your institutions. And when you have these landmark decisions and you've got this political discourse going on, I think there is something of that. There's so much more to do, of course. But I think there's a start. So that's the good news story. And I think it's very important to celebrate these moments. These sort of moments where the engagement took place within wider Canadian society, the government, laws. Our question is, there is this inbuilt ability to fight for rights out there in terms of identity. And our question is, what happens when the spotlight gets turned onto inequalities, injustices within the community? What happens to Miri Piri? If we're looking at gender inequality, if we're looking at caste. And I think, and why is that? It's always puzzled me. If we look to things like, and I think this is an interesting case. Majinder Pal Kaur and Lakhbir Kaur go to the Darbar Sahib, want to do save at the temple. They are denied because of their gender. And Majinder Pal Kaur, as an attorney, uses every opportunity available to her to address the situation with that bastion of tradition, which is the SGPC, the Akal Takht, the Golden Temple, all of those institutions, and she doesn't get 1 inch further. And so, what happens? She's the director of United Sikhs and she takes on the turban issue in France. Fascinating. So I think that is an interesting aspect of a piece of the puzzle that needs to be looked at as well. I was looking at their United Sikh Bulletin that they hand out, that they put online, and it is full of these amazing things United Sikhs is doing. And it's tsunamis and it's floods and it's all over the world. This incredible outreach is happening. And then I looked for what's happening in terms of gender imbalance in Punjab. Nothing. What's happening in terms of gender issues by and large, overall? Nothing. It's all reaching out. So, and you can take a look at that. We can't get away from the gender ratio in India and the fact that this is not a Punjab issue. This is a Sikh issue. The Sikhs have the lowest gender, the skewed gender ratio from all the religious groups. And it's so easy to say, oh, well, you know, it's cultural values versus religious values. It's a Sikh issue. The Sikhs have the highest gender imbalance. Why is that? To what extent is that being addressed by Miri Piri? Where is this deeply held Sikh tenet? It's in Canada. If we look to the demographics in Surrey and certain school systems, where there is a majority of a Sikh population, and I know I'm saying very dangerous things here, but I think at least let's put it out there to look at it as a possibility. What is happening? Where is this being addressed? Where is Miri Piri? The caste system, very important, I think, in this regard. Within Canada, within India, the case that happened in Vienna with the shooting of the Ravidasi, the Ravidasi minister, the Ravidasi leader, that has been basically, the caste part of that has been so downplayed. But caste, if you look at what it certainly appears to be the case, that this happened, this violence and the separation happened from the mainstream community as a result of the caste issue. And then of course the gender violence, we see it in fiction. We see a critique coming out all over the place and addressing this issue. I looked at a report from 2003 from Peel region. These are social workers, Sikh social workers, that basically look at the state of affairs. And they're basically saying, what's the role of religious institutions? They say, this is not anyone else, these are social workers on the ground saying, the role of religious institutions has been pathetic in providing guidance to the couple. Leaders of the institutions are more addressed to put the couple back together rather than addressing the problem of abuse. And the rationale, there's no life without a husband. B, it's very difficult to raise a family without a father. Don't listen to Western culture and its professionals. In our culture, women don't divorce. Social service agencies are Western in nature and will ultimately break up your marriage. And they say it's our belief that the Sikh community is at a standstill. The problem is that individual issues are not community issues. Woman abuse has not become a community issue. Therefore, the community is not able to acknowledge that this is such a serious issue. So, we can certainly, go on, and it would have been wonderful to end at the highlights of what's happening in the community, where the community has gone throughout the century, and it is there. And this is not to say that these that Sikhs in Canada have played a tremendous role, I think, in addressing inequalities. But there's another side of it, and I'd like to put that within the perspective of Miri Piri as well. Thank you.